Wow, come on down. It's great to be here in Chapel Hill. This is the first time I've been here. I was wandering around and I saw a big poster in Polk Place, and it asked the question, what are you for? Well, that's not the question we're going to address tonight, but it's a great question, and I recommend it to you. Is there truth beyond science? But it's often implied that there is nothing that science can't investigate and one day comprehensively understand. And the question we're addressing today is that true? And I think the answer to that question is decisive for our understanding of the relationship between science and religious faith. Now, the answer to our question depends a lot on what we mean by science. What I mean by science is natural science, the sorts of things that are discovered by physics and chemistry and biology and geology and genomics and cosmology and so on. That might seem obvious to a lot of people, but confusion can easily arise because long ago that was not the meaning of the word science. In the 18th century, for example, the word was often used to speak about any systematic knowledge. After all, the meaning of the Latin word scientia, from which the English word science is derived, is just knowledge. But today, that is not what people mean when they talk about science. When using the unqualified word science, they mean, and I mean, natural science. And it is natural science that has gained an enormous epistemological prestige in our society and in our academy, based on its amazing success at describing the world of nature and also the powerful technologies that it has spawned. Now, in the interest of time, and I want us to spend lots of our time on a question and answer basis rather than me just giving a lecture, I'm not going to spend too much time unpacking in detail what makes natural science what it is. But most people realize that there are certain characteristics and strategies that science adopts for obtaining its knowledge and that are the basis of its success. And I identify these strategies really as twofold. A reliance upon reproducibility, that, in other words, that different people can get the same results from repeated experiments or observations. And secondly, an insistence upon a descriptive clarity of a special type, so that the results of an experiment, even if not necessarily its interpretation, are expressed in unambiguous ways that all scientists can agree upon and understand. Otherwise, after all, you wouldn't know whether you had reproducible results. Now, if you want more detail, please read my book. This is the shameless advertising part of the talk. It's called Monopolizing Knowledge. It's a book about scientism. Scientism is the belief that science is all the real knowledge there is. In other words, it's the negative answer to our question tonight. Scientism has been enormously influential in our society and in the academy for the past couple hundred years. Scientism actually is usually implicit rather than explicit. In other words, people don't generally declare an allegiance to scientism. More often, they presume it implicitly. Implicit scientism is rife in the writings of the militant atheists of this century, so-called new atheists. For example, Richard Dawkins writes in his book, The God Delusion, this offhand phrase, the existence of God is a scientific hypothesis like any other. Seems to be implying that all hypotheses that are worth talking about are scientific hypotheses. Or again, here's one of the more explicit versions of scientism that you might read in a recent book from Paul Thagard, his book called The Brain and the Meaning of Life. What is reality? Those things and processes identified by well-established fields of science, using theories backed by evidence drawn from systematic observation and experiments. That's the whole of reality as far as Paul Thagard is concerned. Actually, Richard Dawkins speaks in these terms very, very often in his book. Here's another quote from his book, The God Delusion. Did Jesus raise Lazarus from the dead? Did he himself come alive again 3 days after being crucified? There is an answer to every such question, whether or not we can discover it in practice, and it is strictly a scientific answer. The methods we should use to settle the matter would be purely and entirely scientific methods. So says Richard Dawkins. But look, the resurrection is not a scientific claim, it's a historical claim. The way you establish the truth of historical claims, like the resurrection, or for example, that Julius Caesar was assassinated on the steps of the Roman Senate on the 15th of March 44 BC, is of course not by, quote, purely and entirely scientific methods. No. We need to use methods appropriate to the claims being made. And the evidence that we will seek for historical claims isn't scientific evidence, it's historical evidence. And that will be predominantly in the form of documentary, personal, maybe even eyewitness testimony. Perhaps there'll be some archaeological evidence. And this will all be gathered together, taking advantage of our general understanding of how people tick and of the attitudes and thinking and the background history of the times in which the events occurred. That's how history works. It's not science. Now, the reason why scientism is so important in this context of the relationship between science and the Christian faith is that the critics of belief in God are fond of saying that religion is irrational because there's no evidence for God. But what they're really saying is that there's no scientific evidence for God, or you can't prove God through science. There's plenty of historical evidence for the claims of Christianity. I'll agree that history and the truth of Christianity can't be established scientifically. But my position is that science is plainly not the only route to knowledge. Scientism is a mistake, a ghastly intellectual error. And the most important clarification in my mind in understanding the relationship between science and faith is to recognize that there are many different routes to knowledge, and science is just one of them. If you artificially elevate science into a monopoly of knowledge, then you undermine religion, yes, but you undermine lots of other non-scientific disciplines as well. For example, history and philosophy and literature and the law and art and on and on. So let me give a clear answer to our question. Of course there is knowledge beyond science. Science, wonderful though it is, and true though its knowledge can be, and profound and important, science is nevertheless in no position to give an explanation of the non-scientific disciplines. It's incompetent to do so now, and it will be forever. Nevertheless, I think there is a nagging suspicion that remains. Even if there are parts of human knowledge that aren't meaningfully science, isn't science a much better and more reliable form of knowledge than any other? And hasn't there been an intellectual warfare between Christianity and science for hundreds of years, which science is gradually winning? Well, no. Actually, the idea that Christianity and science have always been at war is a myth. It's a myth that was originally championed in the 19th century, not before, for polemic purposes. And I'd like to offer you a few items of evidence to support the view that actually the relationship between science and Christianity has over history been much more supportive and constructive than is usually conceded. Whoops. I come from MIT. MIT is often thought of as being the high temple of technology in the US, and maybe even in the galaxy. And as befits a high temple, we have pseudo-Greek architecture about some of our buildings, and complete with fluted columns. And if this were truly Greek temple architecture, then at the top of the fluted columns should be the bacchanalian friezes of the drunken orgies of the gods. Instead of that, at MIT, we have the names of the heroes of science and to a lesser extent technology over history. And some would say that the drunken orgies take place across the river in the fraternities. But that's another. Well, several of us thought that one way to try to estimate how influential and how compatible Christianity had been over the centuries of the development of modern science was to take a look at the list of all the names of the people who were on our architecture and ask what fraction of those were Christians. Well, it's a hard question to answer, but roughly speaking, the estimate is 50 to 60%. So that's the first piece of evidence. Any list of the giants of science would include people like Copernicus, Galileo, Boyle, Pascal, Newton, Faraday, Maxwell, and many, many more, all of whom were serious believers in God and in Jesus Christ. So that's the first piece of evidence. It's not the case over history that scientists were somehow divorced from their religious commitments by their science. Second thing is that I observed over decades, actually, of giving talks and meeting people in universities, that far from scientists being weakly represented among the Christians that I met, they are actually very much strongly overrepresented. And this has been known by sociologists for a long time. This is the cover of a book by Robert Wuthnow, who's a very well-known Princeton sociologist of religion. And he refers to this survey data, which shows that if you, for this survey, if you thought that academics were atheistic because of science, you would have expected that people in the sciences would have been by far the most indifferent to or the least likely to believe in God. But actually, that isn't what happens. When you survey academics, you find that, yes, academics as a whole tend less to be religious believers than the rest of the population. But among academics is the people in the social studies and humanities who are less likely to be Christians than those in the sciences. So it just doesn't hold up the idea that somehow science is what has sundered people in the academy from their faith. And the third piece of evidence I'd like to mention is it's worth asking yourself the question, why did modern science grow up almost entirely in the West, where Christian thinking held sway? I mean, there were still civilizations of comparable stability and prosperity and often technology in China and Japan and India. Why didn't they develop the science that we now think of as modern science? If it were true that the Christian church dogmatically opposed all the dangerous innovations of science and thereby stunted scientific development for hundreds of years, as is claimed by the more elaborate of the critics of the relationship between science and religion, well, if that were true, why didn't science rapidly evolve in these other cultures? Well, it didn't, because that's not the way it really worked. A much more constructive reality is, and the case has been made by Stanley Jackie amongst many others, that far from being an atmosphere stifling to science, the biblical worldview of the West was a kind of fertile cultural and philosophical environment or soil in which science was able to grow and flourish. And that it was actually precisely the theology of Christianity that created that fertile intellectual environment. The teaching, for example, that the world is a free but contingent creation of a rational creator, therefore worthy of study on its own merits, because it was good. And the belief that because our rationality is, in a certain sense, in the image of the creator, that we're capable of understanding the creation. These are theological encouragements to the work of empirical science. And when mingled with the desire to benefit humanity for Christian charity's sake, those became led to an increasing momentum, a force that gathered despite any of the admitted strictures that sometimes a threatened religious hierarchy set up against it. So I'd actually like to make a bold counterclaim to the warfare model or mythology of the relationship between Christianity and science. And that is that actually science and Christianity are mutually supportive. There is a sense in which modern science, as we've known it for the past 400 years or so, is already, in a very serious sense, Christian. It was germinated in and nurtured by the biblical philosophy of creation. It was developed and established through the work of largely Christian pioneers, and it continues to attract Christians into its endeavors today. Now, obviously, this view is very different from the common misperception of the warring relationship between science and faith. And that common misperception is fed by many science popularizers and some leading scientists. Of course, a more nuanced view of the relationship doesn't make for a good media copy. You know, people like the battles and the gladiatorial confrontations. That's better TV, isn't it? What troubles me more than that, though, actually, is that there is also a common misperception among Christians. It's fed by well-meaning Christians. And that is the kind of opinion that somehow the established science and the Christian faith are at war. It is being promoted if we take a view, an outlook, by debates suggesting that the incompleteness of scientific knowledge or understanding should be a cause for celebration or satisfaction among Christians. I don't think that way at all. Because what ought to be opposed by Christians is not science, but scientism, this improper, unjustified extrapolation of science as if it's all of knowledge. So what's the antidote to scientism? I believe the antidote to scientism is to realize that because science is not all the knowledge there is, because there is truth beyond science, the descriptions of phenomena at different levels can be simultaneously valid. Now, this is actually commonplace within science itself. And that's why we have disciplines that are different, like physics and chemistry and biology. These are descriptions at different levels. And so those descriptions can be simultaneously true. But there can also be descriptions that go even beyond the scientific level to the human, personal, and purposive aspects of life. And those can be simultaneously true. And I like to illustrate this in terms of the human person. Good job my battery didn't fall. You might say that I am an assembly of electrons and quarks interacting through quantum chromodynamics. That's true. I'm a mixture of a wide variety of chemical elements. For example, hydrogen, oxygen, carbon, and so on. I'm a wonderful system of cooperating cells, guided by genetic codes. That's true. I am a biochemical machine, powered by bioenergy. I'm a mammal with hair and warm blood. I'm a human with consciousness and intelligence, yes. A husband, a lover, a father, a teacher, Yes, and I'm a sinner saved by grace. And I'm an eternal spirit, beloved by God. And I am all of these things simultaneously. Not one of those descriptions is necessarily less true than any other. And not one of them rules out the others once we set aside scientism. Well, let me close by making some remarks about what faith is. Because the anti-theists of today say, very often, that you can base your beliefs on evidence, or you can base them on faith in some authority. And of course, they say that their secular opinions are rational and based on evidence, while religious people, like me, are just irrational faith heads. But that isn't so much an argument as an insult, but that's okay. Our shoulders are broad. I'll concede that the religious belief of many people, especially non-intellectual people, is founded on an acceptance of what they are taught by their religious authority. Yet it's just as true that their scientific belief is an acceptance of the teachings of their scientific authorities. And so if authority is the problem, then the regular Joe isn't going to believe anything. What do we do about this? Well, there is a thoughtful question here, and I'd like to address it. What is faith, and is it in opposition to science? Consider the motto of the Royal Society of London, the first ever English-speaking society for the study of the natural sciences. The motto of the Royal Society is Latin, nullius in verba, which means basically on nobody's word. And according to the Royal Society website, the motto expresses the determination of the fellows of the Royal Society to withstand the domination of authority and to verify all statements by an appeal to facts determined by experiment. Now, I think that nullius in verba is a very fine motto for a scientific society. But it actually can't even really be carried through, even in science. The crucial question, though, is whether such a motto makes sense as a general rule for life. I'd say it's obviously impossible to verify all statements by an appeal to facts determined by experiment, and to pretend that one will do so is a kind of hopeless scientism. Incidentally, the founders of the Royal Society in the 17th century plainly didn't intend the motto in that sense, and they did not rule out religious knowledge, since many of them, as I mentioned already, were actually Christians. They also didn't have a website in those days, so you couldn't check it out. But anyway, here's what I say my Christian faith is, and why I think it's reasonable. My faith is based upon an assessment of many different types of reasons. Most of those are not scientific reasons, but they are nevertheless logical and rational. The most important types of reasons, for me, are a combination of historical evidence and personal religious experience. My faith is based on experience, but not the certainty of reproducible scientific experiments. But still, that's not a reason to discount it. Like everyone else, I make small and large decisions on minimal evidence beyond personal preference and impulse almost every moment of my waking life. And that's what it means to be sentient. And if history is any judge, it is people who act boldly and with determination and commitment, even in the face of risk and incomplete knowledge of the situation, who are successful in the world. Such people are called men and women of action. They act in accordance with a view of the world that is plausible but unproven. That is, they act on faith. And I think that my religious faith, my Christian faith, is quite simply the same principle applied to the matters of God and the Spirit. Now, that's not everything that the Christian faith is, because Christians over the centuries have experienced by faith what we take to be a personal relationship with God. Arthur Stanley Eddington was the discoverer of galaxies and of the internal structure of stars. And he put it like this. He said, "In the case of our human friends, we take their existence for granted. We could read philosophical arguments designed to prove the non-existence of each other, and perhaps even be convinced by them, and then laugh together over so odd a conclusion. I think," he said, "that it is something of the same kind of security that we should seek in our relationship with God." So, can science explain even something as familiar as friendship? No, rather obviously not. Science's methods don't lend themselves to that topic. And does the fact that science can't explain friendship mean there's no knowledge or reality in friendship? Of course not. Friendship is a reality that can't be discovered or explained by science. And this will not surprise us, provided we recognize and reject scientism, the fallacious belief that science is all the real knowledge there is. If we do set aside scientism, pervasive as it is in today's culture, then that opens up the understanding and significance of all sorts of ways that humans understand the world. And the Christian faith is one of those non-scientific approaches to the world. And Christians, like me, say it's actually the most important. But it's not just religious beliefs like Christianity that say there is truth beyond science. Thank you very much for listening.
That is. So scientism seems to be, according to you, something that you think is increasing. So I'm wondering, what do you think has led to the rise of scientism? Have there been particular historical events or changes in society? What do you think has led to its rise?
Okay, thank you for that question. So scientism has been a long time developing, but perhaps the most distinctive transition by which we came to that place we are at today was in the second half of the 19th century. And that was when universities, that up to that time had very predominantly been Christian organizations. Most of the older universities were founded as places of Christian education, often for pastors and preachers. And Christianity had been very predominant throughout the university system up until that time. In the latter half of the 19th century, some of the older universities began a transition towards a more secular view, and some of the more famous secular universities were founded. Perhaps the most significant one in the US was Cornell, and Ezra Cornell was founding alongside of A.D. White this secular university. White himself, although he wasn't anti-religious, was very much not a Christian, and wanted to found a secular organization. And he wrote a very widely read book, which was gathering together lots of the pamphlets that he had published as part of his campaign to secularize higher education in the US. And it was called A History of the Warfare between theology, science and theology in Christendom. And that was the archetype of this perspective, this mythology that somehow science and Christianity had been at war, because A.D. White tried to make the case that there had always been this strong warfare. Well, now, there were arguments. I mean, Galileo was put under house arrest. He never went to jail, but he was put under house arrest for publishing his dialogues on three world systems. But as a result of White's book, there was an enormous transition,
by the early 20th century, most universities had become secular. Once secularism took over in the universities, there was essentially a vacuum which was filled by scientists.
That's helpful. Thank you. So speaking as a fellow scientist, I have to tell you that I think I have a sense where the scientism comes from. So, and you touched on this point briefly in your talk. If I read a scientific publication and someone reports to me that if I mix A and B, that I can get C. And so I take this to heart, and without anyone knowing, I go and I purchase A, and I purchase B, and I go to the lab in the middle of the night, and I mix them together, and lo and behold, I get C. And I have to tell you that it's very satisfying to obtain knowledge in this way. It rules out any possibility of bias, and you sort of know in your heart, in a sense, that this is a true result. So my question is, science is reproducible, and it is clear, and does that make other forms of knowledge, other personal knowledge, does it demean them a little bit? Are they inferior in some way?
Well, certainly the feeling is amongst scientists and amongst academics that perhaps what you just said is true. But I think that's a mistake. I mean, I think science is a very important way of understanding about the world. In fact, I think science's whole emphasis on reproducibility and clarity actually defines what we mean by nature. Nature is those things that display the kind of reproducibility and the kind of measurability and clarity that we require in order to do natural sciences. That's what we really mean by nature today in most of these applications. And so I think science, natural science, is wonderful. That's why I've been doing it my whole career, okay? But the mistake is to think that it's everything, okay? So there is a definite sense that you and I both share, that when you discover something that really is reproducible and you line everything up and you repeat the experiments and they come out right, etc., that is enormously persuasive. But look, there are lots and lots of things in life that are not of that type. And history, I gave you the example of history, which is, in history we're dealing with unique events that can't be reproduced, and therefore you can't study them using this method. And many of the things about our personal and human lives are also incapable of being studied by this approach. For example, as you well know, when we go into a scientific analysis, we deliberately put aside all explanations in terms of purpose, in terms of intentionality. That's part of what we do as scientists. We say we're not particularly interested in explanations that say there is a deliberate reason why this happened. What instead we want is mechanisms. What we want is efficient causes in philosophical terms. This happens because of that, and because of that, and because of that. In other words, we're looking for the laws of nature. And yet, there's lots of things in our lives that are vital, where it is absolutely vital to understand the idea of purpose. He did that because he wanted that to happen and something or else. That's not a scientific explanation. Of course it's not a scientific explanation, and yet it can be tremendously important.
Very good. So let me build on that a little bit. There's another, you mentioned Richard Dawkins in your talk. So he has another famous quote that goes like this: "Faith is the great cop-out, the great excuse to evade the need to think and evaluate evidence. Faith is belief in spite of, and perhaps because of, the lack of evidence." And before we go on the attack against Dawkins, he's not here to defend himself. I think we have to leave open the possibility that personal knowledge and faith, in many instances, people exercise this faith in ways that ignore scientific evidence. Perhaps acting irrationally. So I like to think that personal knowledge and faith becomes sort of a blank check by which we can believe in anything and ignore scientific evidence. So I'm wondering how you personally, balance that, trying to stay reasonable and rational rather than use your faith as a cop-out.
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't agree with his definition. it's a very narrow definition of what faith is. Faith has actually three main strands to it. One is belief, one is trust, and one is a sense of commitment and loyalty. Those three things are all a very important part of what we Christians mean by faith. And in fact, the second two are in many respects more important than the belief strand. But if you just focus on the question of belief, which is what Dawkins was focusing on in that particular quotation, yes, there is. I agree with you. There is such a thing as, if you like, blind faith. I just believe it, and therefore, for me, it's true. Okay? That sort of blind faith, though, I would argue, is not what Christianity calls for. That is not what Jesus taught his followers to do. It is not the way that the Apostle Paul taught or the Apostle Peter taught when they wrote letters to the church. They wrote very carefully argued and rational reasons for things. They gave evidence for why we should believe that Jesus is risen from the dead, because he appeared to various people and 500 people at one time and so on and so forth. So Christianity is often portrayed by its critics as calling for blind faith. I believe that's untrue. And if Christian teachers and preachers call for blind faith, I believe they're misrepresenting the faith. And so we ought, in our intellectual lives and in our personal lives too, to give due weight to all the evidence. So scientific evidence and historical evidence and all sorts of other types of experiences that we have.
So should we never expect to experience a conflict between scientific evidence and our personal faith?
I'm often asked whether I have experienced those types of conflicts. And the answer is not, very rarely, okay? Part of that is because I did not grow up a Christian, and I was 20 years old before I was baptized. So basically, I became a Christian when I was an undergraduate at Cambridge University, and I was already kind of launched on a study of science and so forth. And so when I began to bring my science and my Christianity together, they were in a certain sense growing up together. And I think that is an experience which is more common in Britain and elsewhere in the world than it is in America. I'm an American now, but I know I don't sound like it. So I think that there are people who grow up in religious traditions that teach certain kind of rather restrictive and literalistic kind of interpretations of the Bible. I think that there are parts of those traditions which are at odds with our scientific understanding of the world. So I certainly wouldn't say for a moment that it's impossible for there. I'm certainly not saying it's impossible for there to be conflicts between religious opinions and scientific opinions. I'm just saying that the way I approach Christianity and take the Bible very seriously requires me to think about how do I interpret the Bible in the light of modern science. So take an example. I mean, something I know something about as a physicist, is how old, is the universe? Well, we know how old the Earth and the universe is from science. The Earth is 4 or 5 billion years old, and the universe is 13.8, or maybe it's 13.7 something years old. And everything in physical science goes to confirm the fact that the universe is an old place. So if you come and contradict that by saying, well, the Bible says really the Earth is only, was created in 4004 BC, if you count back using things, then obviously that's conflict. But I don't think that the Christian faith hinges on how old the Earth is. In fact, I'm sure it doesn't. Okay, and so I think that that's just an unfortunate misinterpretation of what the Bible is teaching us.
That's very helpful. So just pushing that a little bit further, how can you simultaneously believe in miracles of the Bible when we don't observe these in a reproducible way? So, and I realize from your talk, these are historical events. They're not amenable to science, but
right.
Still there's got to be some tension there for you.
Well, obviously, scientists are successful because things that happen in the world, many of them are extremely reproducible. Gravity is reproducible. We know that because if we fall off the roof, we hit hard. Doesn't matter when So most of what goes on in the world, in the creation, has been created by God in such a way that it is reliable, that it has a faithfulness about it, that we recognize and we incorporate into our scientific descriptions. So the question about miracles is whether it is necessary in science, or to be a scientist, for example, to assume there is never anything different from the normal course of events. I mean, that's what science is studying. Science is studying the normal course of events. It's studying the way that God orders his creation in the normal way. Well, does our knowledge about that normal course of events rule out the possibility that God might act in ways that are extraordinary? I don't believe it does rule it out. But miracles is a big topic. I mean, after all, it's important to recognize that miracles are not thought of in the Bible as being violations of natural law. I mean, very often, since about the 17th century, people have tended to define miracles as being violations of natural law. That's not the way the Bible thinks about them at all. So miracles is a big question, but I don't believe that it's necessary for us to rule out miracles in order to practice science, and nor did, the famous scientists of history that I mentioned during my talk. I will say, though, that doesn't make me, gullible. I don't accept every story that someone says, oh, this is a wonderful thing happened, blah, blah, blah. I think there are miracles today. I mean, certainly, probably millions of people around the world claim to have experienced miracles. And we certainly have no evidence to discount all of that immediately. But I'm as skeptical as the next person, that this statue has started to drip tears or something like that. I mean,
I think I do too. Let me ask kind of two complementary questions, and these are I really want to know your responses here. So, you just talked about the fact that there's the normal order of things, and the matter that you study and your role as a scientist. You sort of operate in this world of what is reproducible, what can I measure? You walk into the lab and you put that hat on. But you also believe that this is God's created earth, and this is his created normal order of things. So I'm wondering if there are scientific evidences, there are particular facts that are reproducible, that are helpful to you in your faith, things that affirm your belief in Jesus Christ.
Yeah, I actually think there are things, and I said during my talk that I don't think there are scientific proofs of Christianity. That I maintain that view. But that doesn't mean there aren't hints, there aren't things which point us towards God in the natural world. I think there are. I mean, the very fact that we see, just by looking around us, that we, each of us, depend on something that is beyond ourselves, that is enormously stable, steadfast, and proceeds by the most orderly and comprehensible mechanisms that science is discovering. Those types of descriptions begin to sound like the sorts of descriptions that the Bible has for, God. Now, of course, people who aren't persuaded of the reality of God will tend to not personalize that creation, will not recognize the Creator behind it. And I'm not saying that's a proof that there is a personal Creator. But even the most skeptical philosophers of the 18th century recognized that there is a question, why do things exist, and why are they orderly, and why is it that things systematic and so forth. And an answer to that is that that God created them. The other thing I was talking earlier about the age of the universe and related questions. I mean, I actually think that there is a lot of what I discover in my physics that leads me to ask ultimate questions about where it all came from. I mean, it used to be the case 50 or 60 years ago that it was perfectly rational to believe that the universe had always just kind of existed. But we know that's actually not true. The universe has only existed for 13.8 billion years, okay? And so there are various aspects of the universe that are remarkable and begging for an explanation. Another question is, well, why are the laws of nature the way they are? Why is it that they seem to be finely tuned in such a way that there are certain resonances in nuclear cross-sections, there are certain ways in which carbon works to produce special types of bonds which allow the kinds of complexities that you study and so forth to take place, and then the complexities of our consciousness and brains and consciousness. Why is it? Why are things like that? There isn't a good answer to those questions, I think, that goes outside of theological answers.
So is it the sense in which being a Christian could actually strengthen your abilities as a scientist?
I think being a Christian gives you lots of commitments to truth that are absolutely essential to being a good scientist. I don't think there's a Christian way to solve the differential equation. Any more than actually the fact that the people who invented calculus were both Christians. But never mind. That's but so I don't think that there is a sense in which necessarily being a Christian helps you to be a good scientist. But I do think there are ways in which one's science and one's Christian faith can work together so that one strengthens and encourages the other.
Very good. Let me ask one final question before we turn it over to the audience. This came from an older talk that you gave in a conversation you had with Roald Hoffmann. So Roald Hoffmann, if you don't know, is a Nobel Prize-winning chemist. And I thought he made a very interesting statement here, commenting on the relationship between science and his atheist beliefs. He says, "My conviction that there is no God is fundamentally an unscientific conviction. It would take a real conversion experience to change my mind." And I think this is a very helpful statement in many ways, because this is perhaps not a proponent of scientism. This person is allowing that, yes, there is knowledge outside of my ability to measure things, but he's asking for a real conversion experience in order to change his mind. So I'm going to flip this and say, what would it take to change your mind about your beliefs?
Okay. Well, Roald Hoffmann was a great guy. That was a terrific conversation that we had, and he was very honest, I think, about where his convictions come from. And I think he was very right to say that our deepest convictions are, in general, not developed from science. They're developed from other things. They come from other places. But in the end, I would say that, and I mentioned this earlier, that the things which I find most persuasive about the Christian message, the reason, if you like, I'm a Christian, is that I actually find the evidence for the resurrection tremendously persuasive. I just think that there is very good reasons to believe that the resurrection took place. I won't unpack that right now. But that was certainly one of the things which helped to persuade me as an undergraduate at Cambridge to become a follower of Jesus. And so if I'm challenged with this sort of question, what would persuade me to change my mind and become a non-Christian, I think the answer would be simple. If there was some kind of overwhelming evidence that showed that the resurrection of Jesus never took place, then I'd have to say, well, I was wrong. Well, I don't see how that would happen, but I don't think it will happen.
So you mentioned a difference in belief and trust. Can you go into that and dive into that difference a little bit?
Okay, so if you're trying to understand what faith is, I would say faith has three different components. One is belief in propositions. Sometimes it's implied also belief without complete or persuasive evidence. The second is trust in a person or idea. So we can say we have faith in some leader or in some philosophy. That's the second meaning of the word faith. And the third meaning of the word faith is sort of commitment to and followership. So if I speak of the fact that I have faith in my wife and I try to live out that faith, I live in faith towards her, that's the third kind of strand of the meaning of faith. So, as I said, in Christianity, we are called not predominantly to some kind of intellectual belief. We're actually called to be people who trust in Jesus, people who make Jesus our Lord. That's the kind of faith that we're called for. Not to say, well, we know that so-and-so is true because we have faith. That's not the faith that we're kind of called to. And then we're also called to live out that trust by walking in faith, acting in faith towards Jesus and towards our fellow Christians and towards others that God loves. So that's probably about as much unpacking as I should do. Thank you for that question.
So, what do you think about evidence, like archaeological evidence that talks about religions based on idols, polytheistic religions, all kinds of that thing that predate any kind of monotheistic religion as far as you can tell through archaeological evidence and anthropological evidence and things like that?
What do I think about them?
Yeah, like how do you reconcile that with your belief?
Okay, so I think if you read the Bible, it's very obvious that polytheistic and in some cases pantheistic religions were rife in the entire experience of the Hebrew people. So the biblical faith, the monotheistic faith, came out of the experience of people like Abraham and Moses. But it did so in the context of humankind sort of wrestling with beliefs in all kinds of polytheistic and pantheistic viewpoints. So the idea that somehow, the biblical faith was somehow plummeted down from heaven and then sort of everyone got it right from there on, is not the way I read the Old Testament. The Old Testament is talking about the development of the Israelites' understanding of Yahweh, of their God, and their realization that God was not just their tribal deity, who was going to fight off the tribal deities of all the people that were around them and threatening them, but actually that God, to be God, had to be the God of it all, the God who was the creator of it all. And then they began to realize, well, if that's true, well, then God loves not just us, but he also loves these other people. And so the prophets of the Old Testament began to realize that, in the revelation of God, that people were going to come to the people of Israel, and that there was going to be some revelation that covered the whole earth. And then when you think about Christianity, that was the total flowering of this realization that God loves all of his creation and is calling all of it to a constructive and meaningful relationship with him. So, you asked me a very open-ended question. I'm giving you kind of an open-ended answer. But to me, I am not of the opinion that Christianity, is some kind of stamped out handbook that's sent down from heaven. But that actually, if we look at the history that's brought to us in the Bible, we discover that people have discovered God, that God has progressively revealed himself to humans. And that has come to a central focus in the person of Jesus. And I am a Christian because I recognize Jesus as the focus of God's revelation, which then flows out to the future, but also has impact on the past. Sorry, that's way too long an answer to the question, but it was an open-ended question. Thank you for that question.
What are your views on human evolution, and how does Christianity play into that?
Okay. Evolution means different things to different people. As far as scientific evolution is concerned, scientific evolution refers to two main ideas. One is the mechanism of so-called natural selection, and the other is the idea of common descent. So natural selection means that if there are pressures on a species to survive, then if there are mutations that are favorable, those mutations have a tendency to survive, and unfavorable mutations have a tendency not to survive, and as a result there is a gradual development over time. We know that takes place. The reason why hospitals are such dangerous places to go is because they're full of antibiotics, and because they're full of antibiotics everywhere, the bacteria there are in the process of developing resistance to all the antibiotics that we have. And that is natural selection at work. The other part of scientific evolution is the notion that all species are descended from one or a few ancestors, and that there has been a diversification, there has been adaptation by the process of natural selection over long history. The scientific evidence for that, when Darwin first put this forward in his Origin of Species, 1859, was okay, but it wasn't terribly good. But since Darwin, there's been an enormous growth of the evidence for both of these two scientific pillars of evolution, in short. So the scientific evidence, particularly that has developed in the last 20 or 30 years, and our co-presenter here, it works in the area of genomics, but in the area of genomics, the evidence for common descent has become extremely powerful over the last 20 or 30 years. And so, scientifically, there isn't really much argument about the fact that historically these two things have happened. But the arguments come when people say, therefore, God could not have done it. Or therefore, there is no God. Or therefore, it's completely random. You can't deduce that from the fact that there are scientific mechanisms. So people who make that leap from the scientific facts, which are well supported by the evidence now, to philosophical or theological or anti-theological conclusions, that's a different side of evolution, and it's a side of evolution which I find utterly unpersuasive.
Sorry, I'm trying to say this. What about the resurrection is most compelling to you that evidence is the existence of God?
Okay, so I think you're asking me the question, how does the resurrection lead me to believe in God? I certainly think that the resurrection as an historic event, if it took place, shows that there's much more to existence and to reality than one might imagine, than would be dreamt of in your philosophy, to quote Shakespeare, okay? So at the minimum, that's what one would conclude, because that kind of event is kind of unprecedented. What the New Testament says is that Jesus was, in a certain sense, shown to be the Son of God by his resurrection from the dead. And I certainly buy into that. I mean, I certainly think that the reason, and this is part of the reason why I gave the answer that I did, the reason why Christians see Jesus as the unique Son of God is, in a certain sense, backed up uniquely by the events surrounding the resurrection. The resurrection, of course, was the thing that eventually sent out that dispirited band of Jesus' disciples and transformed them from, basically people who are hiding away from the authorities into people who went out and started to proclaim the fact that Jesus had risen from the dead. So the resurrection is the foundation of Christian faith. And the Christian faith itself, of course, is an integral part of the biblical story. So I don't know whether that answers the question. It's the best I can do for now.
So during your lecture, you argued science and faith can exist harmoniously, and the cornerstone of this argument was that 50 to 60% of past famous scientists were Christian. but I feel like that was during a time and place when Christianity was the entire foundation of society, and nowadays there's theories like the Big Bang Theory, and there's a definite decline in religion in Western society. So how do you defend that reasoning?
Yeah, I think you're right. I think it's certainly the case that Western society, Europe more so than America, but nevertheless Western society as a whole is far more secular than it was through most of history. But but let me respond on a couple of levels. One level I want to respond on is it's often implied that those scientists of history were somehow kind of nominal believers, that they just went along with the general trend of society. But actually, if you study their lives, that for all the people that I cited, that's simply not the case. I mean, there were, of course, nominal believers among scientists, but the people that I mentioned were none of them nominal believers. I mean, if you take a person like Isaac Newton, I mean, he actually wrote more about Bible interpretation than he wrote about science. He didn't publish it, but he did write it. Okay, so that shows that he was intensely interested in these kinds of questions. Okay, so today it's a different situation. We have a secular society, and very particularly, we have the secular universities. In fact, surveys show that by far the most secular organizations in our whole Western American society are elite universities. So if you go to the Harvards and the MITs and the Yales and, well, maybe, UNCs, I don't know what that might be, you find that the level of religious belief is relatively low compared to the society as a whole. It might be 20 or it might be 25% of the people at those universities on the faculty, etc., who might acknowledge some kind of belief in God, which is far lower, of course, than society as a whole. Society as a whole, if you ask those questions in America, something like 70% of people will say that they believe in God. So yes, it's true, we live in a more secular society, and what's of very great interest to sociologists is that the most secular places are the elite universities, and there isn't really a good explanation for why that is. You can have your own suspicions, but we'll leave that to the sociologists to figure that out. But I don't think that that is a proof one way or the other. I don't want to say that Christianity is true because everyone else believes it, okay? And that's certainly not what I'm saying. And I wouldn't want to suggest that for a moment. It's perfectly clear that everyone in our universities does not believe it. But it's also false to say that nobody believes it, okay? And it's hard to estimate, except by these surveys, what the level of belief, let's say, on the faculty of a major university is. But it's not in the few percents. It's in the few tens of percents. Okay, and so it's certainly not the case that we're often invited to believe that sensible, rational, intellectual people simply don't believe in Christianity. But thanks. It was a great question. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your talk. How do you reconcile Christian belief with like scientific studies, etc., or just general scientific consensus on homosexuality and development and how that occurs?
Okay, so I think Christian belief and doctrine is pretty straightforward on what the sort of norm is for sexual practices amongst people. When Jesus was asked about divorce, his answer was, in the beginning, God made them male and female, and therefore a man will leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. And so that has been the norm, the understanding of Christians and of other societies, since before Christ and up until the last, let's say, 30 or 40 years. What I would say is that Christ also taught us, Christians, to love our neighbor, to care for the people around about us, not to be judgmental, lest we be ourselves judged, and so forth. So my answer is, I think that it's pretty clear what historical understanding has been, and the biblical understanding of the normal practices of sexuality are, but I certainly am not intending to be condemnatory, and I would regard my love of my fellow man to embrace people of all kinds of perspectives. Now, you asked me a bit about the scientific side of things. I'm not all that well educated on what we know about the medical and biological aspects of homosexual practice and activity. It seems to me pretty cloudy, and it's actually not the case that sort of it's all determined by genetics, but it's clear that all kinds of environmental and related factors come into the question. But that's about all I know about that, and I'll leave that to some other expert.
Just listening to you talk about how you think through just like the comparison between your faith and then also science makes me wonder what that process looks like for you in terms of, if you do find something that kind of comes to like a head, it seems like it's at odds with each other. What is that process for you in terms of like your religion, like the religious study? Is it like very deep theological pursuits on your part, or is it more so, okay, well, I'm going to trust in science in this regard?
Okay, I think I kind of understand the question. I think, one of the important things to recognize is if we take seriously the Bible, and one of the reasons, of course, we take seriously the Bible if we're Christians is because, as far as we can tell, Jesus took the Bible seriously. Of course, for Jesus, the Bible meant the Old Testament. But we also take the New Testament seriously because it's the primary documents that speak about Jesus and about his ministry and about what happened in the early church and how it grew. I certainly take the Bible very seriously, and I regard it as, in a certain sense, the guiding and definitive document through which we understand what the Christian faith is all about. So, if there are parts of what have been, let's say, our traditional understandings of the Bible, which seem to be at odds with the findings of science, then that does produce a certain level of tension. So, for example, it's certainly the case that up until the 17th century, practically all Christians thought that the universe was young, maybe around 6,000 years. Okay, that was the default belief until then. And it wasn't just among Christians, that was the default belief throughout the whole of society, okay? We now know, I would say, that that's not the case. There was, of course, a process gone through historically of tension between those things and trying to figure out how the Bible could be consistent with an old earth. That process has basically been gone through. I don't claim that process as having been my own, okay? Because it's been done by theologians and scientists and Christians and teachers for 400 years, 300 years. There are probably going to be you can think of other confrontations over history. One of the difficulties I have as a European, or Englishman actually, but is that I come from a society where, for example, the controversy between evangelical Christianity and evolution never really had the kind of tensions that happen in the US. The US has a history of struggle and strife between evolution and Christianity, that surrounds famous court cases and so on and so forth. I, as a European, find that very bizarre. To me, evolution has never been a big deal. I don't have a problem if evolution, if common descent, and if natural selection are the way that God brought about the adaptation and the richness and complexity of the biosphere. I don't have a problem with that. But I can imagine there are people who have been taught in their churches in America. I know there are people who have been taught in churches in America that somehow evolution is some dreadful evil. I mean, if you can't really be a Christian and believe in evolution. I just think that's a mistake. I think it's a misinterpretation of the Bible. The Bible does not, in any complete sense, interpret itself. And I think that what the Christian church needs to do is, when it comes to those types of impasses or tensions or confrontations, needs to step back and accept that even if the Bible is itself, inspired by God, our own personal inspiration in terms of what we think our interpretation of what the Bible means is not necessarily inspired by God. I could be wrong about that, okay? In other words, it's an attitude of a little bit more humility that is required, I think, by people in the churches and in their own belief. So, I don't know, that's kind of to the point you were getting at. I hope it was helpful.
I think we've got time for 2 more questions. Good on there.
Hey, good evening. Based upon your answer to previous questions, I was wondering if you take a more allegorical approach to the Christian account in Genesis, and what does that look like for you?
The first 3 chapters of Genesis are, of course, some of the more problematic chapters in terms of their relationship to our modern understanding of the way the universe developed and so forth. The Bible is full of different types of literature. There is history, there are songs, there is poetry, there is prophecy, there are instructions to churches, there are rituals, and so on and so forth. The one type of literature that is not present in the Bible is scientific literature, because there was no science as we currently understand it in the time of the Bible. I don't mean to say people didn't know anything about nature; they did, but there's nothing approximating a scientific textbook or a scientific description as you would find it in a journal article in the Bible. So it's a terrible mistake, in my view, to approach the first few chapters of Genesis as if God ought to have given me a scientific description in the sense we understand science now of how things happen. In fact, he didn't. What I think Genesis 1 and 2 and 3 are about is much more a hymn of worship to the Creator than it is some kind of hardcore scientific description of one thing came after another. And that I'm not the first person, and neither are any of you the first person to take that attitude. People throughout Christian history, from the 1st century onwards, have seen in Genesis the value and, in some respects, the compulsion to take a more metaphorical understanding of what the first few chapters of Genesis are about. In part, that's because the first few chapters of Genesis it's hard to make sense of them even quite apart from scientific theory. For example, how was there light before there was the sun and the moon and the stars? Okay? I mean, people in the 1st and 2nd centuries asked themselves those questions, the Christian fathers, and they came to the conclusion that, well, it was metaphorical, or it was analogical. And so there have been over Christian history a whole host of different interpretations of Genesis and of other biblical passages. And so I don't think that it's unfaithful to recognize that, first of all, Genesis isn't a scientific textbook, and secondly, its context tells you that it's more of a hymn of worship. And so the message of Genesis is not how did God create the world, but that he created it. So in the context of the Hebrews, that was the most important message, because they were in the process of realizing that their God was not the tribal deity that they probably originally thought he was, but that he was the creator of the whole thing. And so the most important message, chapter 1, verse 1, in the beginning, God created.
Last question. You mentioned evidence surrounding the resurrection. Could you speak further to that and maybe list some of the authors or sources of bodies of evidence that you find convincing?
It's going to be hard for me to give you chapters and verses or references, but for example, there are lots and lots, many people have written about the evidence for the resurrection. There are popular forms of it. The Case for Christ, for example, is one example of a book that's a popular approach. You can go to the more academic, the other extreme, and talk about books like N.T. Wright's The Resurrection of the Son of God, which is a highly scholarly investigation of the New Testament documents. I'm in the process of publishing a book that's based on all the questions I've been asked at Veritas forums. I don't think you guys' questions are going to quite make it, but that's one of the questions that I always get answered, and that's going to be answered in the book. So when it comes out, which won't be till next year, the answer will be in there.
Very good. I think that was a very helpful